Alright guys, real quick before we begin, I want to bring up that I have another channel for Pokemon What If content. So if you enjoy that sort of thing, feel free to head on over there after this video. Link is in the description. Alright, I figured I'd go ahead and make this short video to go ahead and give you guys the lineup for What If I wrote the MCU's Phase 1. Now, for those that may be new to the channel, this series is going to be sort of my take on the whole what if Marvel never sold the film rights to their characters thing. So I'll basically be having access to every hero. In this video, we'll be mainly going over what projects will be in Phase 1, showing the title cards for each project, and announcing casting for the main characters. This way, I don't gotta do it all on each movie's respective part. Alright, first up, in my MCU rewrite, is our first Spider-Man movie. Since I'm looking at this series like if I was Kevin Feige in 2008, and I had the film rights to all of Marvel's characters, and Spider-Man was, and still is, Marvel's most popular solo hero. So, it would make sense that he would get the first movie. Now, I know some of you are wondering which Spidey I'm going to use between Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, and Tom Holland. So, I'll go ahead and get to showing that. But first, I should let y'all know about what this movie is going to be called. The title of this Spidey movie is Spider-Man: Sins of Heroism. This title was suggested to me by a viewer under the name of y.exe. So, shout out to you if you're watching this. This will be a Spidey origin film, meaning we get to see the Spider-Man origin story, with Peter getting his powers and Uncle Ben getting shot. Now, time to cast Peter Parker for this movie. And I decided to go with Andrew Garfield, since, like I said earlier, I'm looking at this as if I'm Kevin Feige in 2008, and I had the film rights to all of Marvel's characters. Tobey would be a bit too old to be playing a high schooler, and Tom would be too young. So I'm giving it to the 25-year-old at the time, Andrew Garfield. Plus, Andrew's a great Spidey, he just needed a better script. Now, on to the rest of the casting for the main characters for this movie, including the villains. Our love interest for this will be Black Cat, played by Felicity Jones, which, fun fact, she's the only one of Spidey's main 3 love interests that hasn't been brought into live action yet. I'm not counting Felicia Hardy's appearance in the Amazing Spider-Man 2 here, since she isn't shown to be the Black Cat yet. And I know some of you are probably like, but Peter didn't meet Felicia until he was in college, and Felicia was in her 20s. Well, I probably will have to de-age Felicia a bit, but I suppose it could probably work. The next casting I'll cover for here is the casting for our main villain of this movie, and this is a villain suggested by my good friend Pickle Dill, being the Punisher. Before I go on, I'll go ahead and say that the Punisher originally got his start in the comics as a Spidey villain after the Jackal hired him to assassinate Spider-Man. As for why the Punisher is the villain, I'll leave that for the movie to explain. As for casting, I've casted John Bernthal in the role, since he already plays the Punisher in the Punisher Netflix series, and honestly, he does a pretty good job in that role, well, in my opinion. The next 2 castings for this movie I'll cover are our 2 side villains for this movie, being the Shocker and Mac Gargan. And I've decided to keep the castings we've had in the actual MCU for those 2 characters. Since I quite liked MCU Shocker and Mac Gargan in Spider-Man Homecoming, I just wish they did something with that Mac Gargan post-credit scene. So, Joaquin Woodbine will be playing our Shocker, and Michael Mando will be playing our Mac Gargan, and eventual Scorpion. Next up is Spider-Man's biggest non-superpowered hater, J. Jonah Jameson. Casting for him will stay the same. It was the Raimi trilogy by getting J.K. Simmons to play the role. Let's be honest, he is absolutely perfect for this role. There's one last casting I need to cover for this movie, and it's for Dr. Connors, who will be Peter's mentor or figure for this trilogy before I eventually have him become the Lizard. And honestly, we can probably keep the casting that the Amazing Spider-Man did with Risey fans. If you're watching this, I am so sorry if I mispronounced your name. Like, I am so sorry. Playing the part. Alright, now on to the next movie, and our second in my Rewritten MCU, being our first Captain America movie, titled Captain America: Stars and Stripes. Now, for casting for this movie, our first casting for this movie is for our main star, Steve Rogers, aka the Star-Spangled Man with a Plan, Captain America. Steve will be played by Chris Evans, like in the actual MCU, since he was amazing in that role. Bucky Barnes will be played by Sebastian Stan, since like Chris Evans as Steve Rogers, Sebastian Stan did a solid job as Bucky. Peggy Carter will be played by Haley Atwell, since I think she did a pretty good job as Peggy. I just wish she had more screen time. Now, for our villain for this movie, and I figured I'd go with one of his most iconic villains, being the Red Skull. Red Skull will be played by Hugo Weaving, since I quite enjoyed his take on the character. Even if Red Skull wasn't one of my favorite aspects of the MCU Captain America movies, our third movie will finally be bringing everyone's favorite genius billionaire playboy philanthropist, Mr. Tony Stark, aka Iron Man. For Iron Man, I plan to keep Robert Downey Jr. in the role, since honestly, I don't really see anyone else being able to play Tony Stark as well as he can. Our next casting is for Pepper Potts, and I'll keep Gwyneth Paltrow, and she did a good job in my opinion with the role. James Rhodey Rhodes is next, and I'm just gonna go ahead and cast Don Cheadle from the beginning. This way, we don't have to worry about recasting Terrence Howard over a salary dispute. Happy Hogan will still be played by Jon Favreau, since he was hilarious as Happy. And now, for the villain of this movie. And while I could have kept Obadiah Stane, aka Ironmonger, but I don't want this project to constantly get compared to Iron Man 1. So I will bring in Anton Vanko, aka Crimson Dynamo. And while we still keep the villain having the same powers as the hero cliche, we get to see Tony fight his first armored villain in Crimson Dynamo. As for casting, Ron Perlman will be playing the role. Our fourth project will be our first Thor movie, titled Thor: God of Thunder. As for casting, I'm pretty much keeping it the same as the actual first Thor movie, although I will be including the Midgard Serpent. And before the Norse mythology enthusiasts come into my comments saying, well actually, the Midgard Serpent's name is Jormungandr. I'm aware his name is Jormungandr. They call him the Midgard Serpent in the comics. So, if you have a problem with that, take it up with Marvel, not me. Our fifth project for my Rewritten MCU is our first Fantastic Four movie. And this one, I get to cast everything myself. Let's start with the smartest man alive, Reed Richards. Casting-wise, I decided to go with John Krasinski, since he is currently the most popular fan cast for Reed. An obvious choice, immediately coming off the acquisition of 20th Century Fox by Disney, Krasinski has been in the mix for Mr. Fantastic. Even further to that, he even played the part of Mr. Fantastic very briefly in Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. Next up is Susan Storm, aka Invisible Woman. And for her, we need someone that has good chemistry with John Krasinski. So, I decided to go with Emily Blunt. Alone being a real-life couple, these two have shown their on-screen chemistry with their heroic couple role in A Quiet Place as well. Now on to Sue's little brother, Johnny Storm, aka the Human Torch. Fun fact, Johnny Storm is not the original Human Torch. The original is an android named Jim Hammond, debuting in Marvel Comics all the way back in 1939. But we're not touching that variant of Human Torch. So we're going with the more well-known Human Torch, Johnny Storm. And for him, I picked Zac Efron to play him. So he started out as one of the young stars of Disney's High School Musical. Zac Efron has come a long way since then. In a variety of roles, he has been funny, dramatic, and the hero on screen. It's not hard to see him stepping into a superhero role before long. Efron has the charisma and young cockiness as needed to bring Johnny Storm to life. Now, on to our casting for Ben Grimm, aka The Thing. For him, I decided to pick Jason Segel. The complexity of a character like Ben Grimm is multifaceted, and some fans believe that Jason Segel has the ability to deliver a convincing portrayal. As the most humorous member of the Fantastic Four, Grimm's character is also the most pitiful, as his abilities make him appear as a grotesque creature. Jason Segel has aptitude for conveying both humor and profound sorrow, citing his performances in Forgetting Sarah Marshall and How I Met Your Mother, exemplary instances of his range. Jason Segel also has the talent to make The Thing a lovable character, similar to Groot and Drax. And now, cast our main villain. And I've decided to go with one of the most iconic villains for the Fantastic Four, and Reed's arch nemesis, Dr. Victor Von Doom, aka Dr. Doom. For his casting, I decided to go with Cillian Murphy, since, like Krasinski for Reed, Cillian Murphy is his most common online choice for the next Dr. Doom actor. Cillian Murphy is known for works like Dunkirk, 28 Days Later, and A Quiet Place Part 2, all of which prove his artistic malleability. He is also no stranger to playing comic book villains, as his long work relationship with director Christopher Nolan led to his playing my personal favorite Batman villain, Scarecrow, in all three films of the Dark Knight trilogy. There's no doubt that Murphy would make a convincing Dr. Doom. Next up is our sixth project of my Rewritten MCU, being Ant-Man and the Wasp. For this, I decided to go with Hank Pym's Ant-Man instead of Scott Lang, since while Paul Rudd was Scott Lang, was certainly a highlight of the MCU Ant-Man trilogy, going with Hank Pym first makes more sense. As for casting, we'll start with Hank Pym himself. And my good friend Pickle Dill suggested I have Anthony Starr play Hank Pym, since he has that good balance of all-American boy and sociopath. Plus, he most likely could show the abusive side of Hank Pym, due to him playing Homelander in The Boys. Next up is our casting for the Wasp. And for her, I've decided to go with Kristen Stewart, who was also suggested by Pickle Dill, since she has spunk when not playing insipid nothings like Bella Swan. Also, Ultron will be in this movie, but he won't be a villain yet. He'd be an AI that helps Hank, like how Jarvis helps Tony. As for casting, he'll be voiced by James Spader, since while MCU Ultron isn't one of my favorite takes on my personal favorite Marvel villain, James Spader as Ultron was always a treat to listen to. especially in Marvel What If. Now, for our villain for this movie, and while this is an Ant-Man origin story, meaning AIM will be involved, they won't be the main villains for this movie. Instead, I'm going with David Cannon, aka Whirlwind. Casting wise, I'll go with John Boyega as our main villain for this movie. Well, to play our main villain in this movie. Our 7th project is The Incredible Hulk. And I'm probably going to keep the casting from the 2008 Incredible Hulk movie, except I'm going to recast Thunderbolt Ross and remove Abomination from this movie. Thunderbolt Ross will be recasted from William Hurt to Harrison Ford, mainly due to the tragic passing of William Hurt back in 2022. Also, I will have Samuel Stearns, aka the Leader, be the main villain instead of Abomination, with Samuel Stearns being played by Tim Blake Nelson. Finally, our last project for Phase 1 is our first Avengers movie, titled Avengers AIM, with George Tarleton, aka MODOK, as the villain. And I will have Andy Serkis voice MODOK. And as for casting for the heroes, basically every hero from this phase except the Fantastic Four will be in this movie. So for those that decide to skip to this movie, I'll go ahead and list the heroes that are in this movie. For this movie, we have Tony Stark, played by Robert Downey Jr., Bruce Banner, played by Edward Norton, Thor, played by Chris Hemsworth, Ant-Man, played by Anthony Starr, Wasp, played by Kristen Stewart, Captain America, played by Chris Evans, and Spider-Man, played by Andrew Garfield. So basically, we're going to be having the original comic lineup for the Avengers, plus Cap and Spidey. And that's our lineup for Phase 1. Feel free to rank these 8 movies by which one you're the most hyped for to the one you're the least hyped for. Personally, I'm the most hyped for Spider-Man Sins of Heroism and Fantastic Four. I'll go ahead and get on out of here. Ace!